Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Kubiak. I'm a senior fellow at the Center on the Future of War, and I co-direct ASU's online MA in Global Security. This is the last event in our fall series where we featured the work of our MA in Global Security's professors of practice. And don't be disappointed, though, because we are planning to do similar events in the spring featuring other MA faculty as well. So I hope you'll join us then. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing about the research being done by Professor Candace Rondeaux and her team at ASU's partner, the DC think tank, New America. Candace is a globally recognized researcher and investigative reporter. She directs a program at New America called Future Frontlines, a public intelligence service for next generation security and democratic resilience. She is a columnist for the World Politics Review and a contributing writer for the Daily Beast. Catalyzing the global human pursuit of dignity, justice, equity, transparency, and accountability is a through line in all her work. Candace has served as a senior program officer at the U.S. Institute for Peace, where she launched the Resolve Network, which is a global research consortium on conflict and violent extremism. And she was a strategic advisor to the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. She has documented and analyzed political violence in South Asia and all around the world for the Washington Post and the International Crisis Group. She has several current research projects underway, as she is wont to do. She and her team at Future Frontlines have already launched, or recently launched as of yesterday, a new report documenting how Russia leveraged its longstanding military cooperation with the UAE to piggyback the delivery of sensitive military material to forces allied with Libyan strongman Khalifa Haftar and operatives for the Russian proxy, the Wagner Group, in a potential violation of standing UN arms embargo. Today, however, she came to discuss the Future Frontlines project she leads on the role of social media in the January 6th mob attack on the US Capitol. It is a work in progress, but she's got some very interesting takes on it. So Candace has about a 20-minute or so presentation, maybe more or less, to start with, and then we'll entertain questions in a question and answer session afterwards. For the sake of simplicity and for the sake of recording quality, we're going to just do questions and answers through the chat feature. You send them in, I'll moderate the questions, and we'll have a conversation after the fact, after Candace is done speaking. Okay, with that, Candace, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. It's great to be here. It's been a while since we've had this kind of gathering, and a lot has happened in the last year. I think for all of us as individuals, but of course as a community of researchers and lifelong learners. So it's always exciting for me to get to talk to students and faculty at ASU. I wish I was there because it's sunnier and warmer than it is here in Washington. So I thought I would just kind of start out by first, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully I don't lose you as I do it. To give you a little background about Future Frontlines as a program, and hopefully you all can see that, and talk a little bit about the project overall, which has been running now for several months, but it is, as Jeff noted, very much a work in progress. So I just want to have you guys keep that in mind as we're talking, and I hope we can just have a conversation a little bit about sort of what you're thinking about January 6th and its meaning for the future of democracy and stability in our country. So hopefully move ahead. So it's important to kind of give you kind of a sense of the origin story of what Future Frontlines is and where it came from. A couple of years ago, I was working with Daniel Rothenberg, who of course leads the Center on the Future of War, and Peter Bergen, who is the co-director of the Center on the Future of War, on a project about proxy warfare. And in the process of doing that work, a lot of the research I ended up doing focused on how information is used today to influence outcomes in proxy warfare. So in particular, I chased, this shadowy group of paramilitaries known as the Wagner Group that, is run by a Russian oligarch by the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who also happens to be a guy who was implicated in the Russian interference scheme in the 2016 elections. And from that work, I became more and more intrigued by the idea that actually something seems to be changing about conflict and the character of conflict and the character of competition globally and locally. And one of the big things that seems to be changing is the way in which technology and information technology is speeding up the pace of conflict and escalating clashes And of course, we know about this from looking at Syria and how ISIS, recruited people online. Back in the day, I didn't really give that much credence, but increasingly I've come around to the idea, especially with the events over the last year or so in the United States, that there really is this very deep intersection between the way emerging technologies are shaping the way humans interact with each other and therefore compete with each other and conflict with each other, both online and the real world. So the premise of the Future Frontlines program is really coming from that, moving from on the ground conceptualization of warfare to something a little bit more online as well as offline. So seeing how they blend together. And the main question at the heart of all of our work is how can we make sense of information disorder? We talk a lot about disinformation, and its effects, but I think we don't really think about it oftentimes when it's so far away. We've been hearing a lot about Facebook, as you all know, and the reporting and the whistleblower, Frances Haugen, and some of the revelations around how Facebook also has been wrestling with this question about how information disorder impacts their business model and the communities that are subscribed to their services. Obviously, some of the big effects are polarization, extremism, and erosion of democratic norms and potentially violent conflict. So when we think about Future Frontlines, what we're really talking about are this sort of the intersection of these worlds. A lot of the work that we try and do is blend different methods and different disciplines to try and see, how, for instance, the ways in which companies protect themselves from cybersecurity attacks intersects with tech policy, and then how developments in computer science affect the ability of information researchers and data scientists to do forensic work, and then how that forensic work allows human rights activists who are trying to understand and document, let's say, war crimes or sort of major violations of human rights in a given setting, to go back and not just collect eyewitness evidence, but really collect hard digital evidence that shows repeated patterns of abuse and violations of human rights norms and laws. And then, of course, journalism, is always there as a kind of, important tool for documenting in a very systematic and ethical way some of the things we're seeing. So we kind of operate at the intersection of all these worlds. And a lot of the work that we try and do, as I say, is blend methods. A big piece of the work is using open source investigation techniques. So using publicly available data, that can be everything from social media data to news articles, to journal articles, to corporate registries, to better understand how individuals and organizations network together, both online and offline, to move together toward a particular goal or a strategic outcome. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the project itself and its origins. Some of you may have heard of an organization called Bellingcat, which is a research collaborative based in the UK and the Netherlands that very famously, several years ago in 2015, used social media forensics to explore and examine rumors and evidence that the shoot down of MH17, this Malaysia Airlines jet over Ukraine, might have been conducted by Russian separatists. So this is in the middle of the Crimean War, and it's at the peak of violence. And the jet was down, and 298 people were killed in that shoot down. And Bellingcat was one of the first sort of organizations to begin in a very systematic way to use a kind of volunteer model for calling for collection of online materials. So, Twitter posts and Facebook posts and, all kinds of digital media to try and then take the post, whether it's text or video or photos, and then create a composite picture of what is, a puzzle or a mystery. And they've done that very successfully. So about a week before January 6th occurred, of course, everybody was on vacation, not really thinking very hard, at least I think probably still in a holiday stupor. But some folks who work on this kind of digital forensic work sent out a call saying, we're worried that something might go down on January 6th. We're seeing signs online that something much more serious than everybody else was predicting might actually happen. So there were a number of researchers, many of them based in the United States, some of them at the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, some of them at Bellingcat, some based at universities. I would say, there's a core of about 200 to 300 researchers of different stripes who were in this conversation about the fear that something bad might go down on January 6th. But no particular plan was made, except to say that we should be on the lookout and we should be in touch. But then on January 6th in the morning, it became pretty evident that the crowd that gathered that day, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. The crowd that gathered that day was going to be much larger than anybody predicted. And in fact, I actually happen to live about 10 blocks from the Capitol. And it was evident to me, even 3 days beforehand, that there was something different happening in my neighborhood. People that I wouldn't normally see, wearing MAGA hats, Trump flags, shirts, and so forth, in my neighborhood were wandering around looking a little bit confused. But I didn't really think much of it until on the morning when there were much more visible signs that the crowd that was going to end up at the Capitol was much larger. So the origin story of this project is about how sort of your prior preparation, prepares you for this moment, and yet you don't know exactly what to expect. And one of the kind of big takeaways from sort of the evolution of open source investigation is that, crowdsourcing is a very powerful tool, but it's even more powerful when people are kind of switched on and are kind of expecting and planning for a big event, and they can quickly move to capture information. So at about, I would say, 1 o'clock in the afternoon on January 6th, we got a huge, massive email, and a tweet went out from Bellingcat calling all volunteers to begin collecting everything they could from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Parler, Snapchat, you name it. And hundreds responded to that call. A giant Excel sheet, a Google sheet, was put together so that we could all kind of collectively, in real time, add all the new information that we had, links, archived videos, archived photos, into this giant collective Google sheet. And it was from all over the world. You name it, Brazil, Europe, the United States, Canada, were responding to this call as it was happening in real time. And one of the most interesting things about January 6th is that very much like Syria and the way that Syrians experienced the civil war, this was really the first moment when you had a kind of mass event that was being recorded by millions of people, literally around the world, who were simply watching it, vis-a-vis their, Twitter accounts or their Facebook accounts, and sharing with each other a lot of information. But of course, the participants in January 6th themselves, of course, were uploading photos, videos. And one place they were doing that was to a platform called Parler. Parler is a social media platform sort of meant to be like a rival of Twitter. In fact, it sort of expressly kind of calls it a plucky startup that is meant to be an alternative to Twitter for folks who are more libertarian minded, more conservative in their orientation, who did not particularly appreciate the rising backlash within tech companies, especially at Facebook and on Twitter, against certain social movements, including QAnon and others, and perceived that mainstream social media platforms were in fact censoring conservative voices and views. And so Parler really kind of comes out of what we call the alt tech movement, which rose to prominence after the Charlottesville march in 2017, the so-called Summer of Hate March, where there were lots of clashes between far right and far left, and then sort of moderate protesters near the University of Virginia campus in Charlottesville. That event set off a whole cascade of attempts by different media and tech companies to develop their own products where they had their own rules about what can go on and can be posted online without it being taken down or modified or moderated in any way. And so Parler really comes from what we would call the sort of fringe or alt tech movement. And it was started in 2018 by a group of folks who we now know were also closely associated with the Cambridge Analytica experiment with Facebook that so famously was influential in some of the outcomes of the 2016 election. So interestingly, Parler very quickly presented itself right on the day as a very key platform where a lot of folks who were pro-Trump and were actually at the rally were uploading their content. But the story doesn't really stop there, as we all know. The story actually really begins when so much of that content seems to be so outsized and unmoderated that Amazon, 4 days after the attack, shuts down Parler, basically ceases and desists hosting it on its servers. And at the same time, Apple and Google tell Parler's executives, we're taking down your app until such time as you can figure out how to moderate your content better. So it was a real blow for Parler, but also a really unique moment in the history of social media platforms and this kind of technology, because basically you had these very large, the 5 big tech companies telling a relatively small platform that only had about 15 million users, you can no longer operate on our services because the content on your platform is so toxic that we believe that it caused the events of January 6th. And so it sets up this very interesting question that occurred to me and some of my colleagues who are working on this project. What makes Parler different? Was it different? Was it more culpable in some way? Was there something about it that made it more influential for this particular crowd of folks who showed up at the Capitol on January 6th? And we should note that among those people, now some 633 have been charged and arrested. And that is only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we suspect that probably hundreds more may be ultimately indicted, but we're only really at the beginning of the story of January 6th. So the question we had looking at all of this was, well, is there any truth? How would you evaluate whether Parler or not was much more influential? But before we could even answer the question or try and even develop some sort of research design, several days later, after Parler was deplatformed by Amazon, a hacker published a leak of all of Parler's user documents, user data. And that consisted of hundreds and hundreds of millions of posts, and which consisted of videos and texts and photos and so forth. Although we don't know that it was a complete set, what we do know is that it was a lot of data. And it was a really unique chance to try and actually now answer the question that we were asking, which is, how is Parler different from the way other platforms operate, and what influence did it actually have on the events of January 6th? So that's kind of the research question or set of research questions we started with. But you can't answer these questions as a journalist, right? You need special tools, you need special talents. And so I want to mention several of our colleagues who are on this project who are really important and very pivotal to our work. First is Tom Taylor, who was a professor of mathematics at ASU, and he is also a member of the Center on the Future of War, and then also Professor Sean Walker, who is on West Campus and works with the Data and Society program. And these two are so pivotal and so central to our work. We could not do what we do without them. We also have a team of student researchers who work with us from the Data Mining Machine Learning Lab, who help us with sort of task orientation on collecting data and wrangling it. So, and we have a couple of other folks who are journalists who are on the New America side that work with us as well. What are we finding, you're wondering? Well, what we're finding is there is a lot of correlation between the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the anti-COVID lockdown marches, as well as the Back the Blue marches that were all kind of happening in 2020. Excuse me one second. And those events took place, of course, across the country. We saw marches all over. But there are some states that really stood out in terms of correlation, although not necessarily causation, between events and then Parler posts. And so that's kind of what we're probing into right now, trying to understand, to what degree did folks who were on Parler, were they motivated by some of the protests that were happening in their neighborhood? And to what degree were they also inspired by what they were seeing on Parler and then influenced in that way? So we had to break down the problem into kind of 3 transects. And then I'll let Jeff kind of jump in with some questions and answers here in a minute. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Our sort of problems that was, well, how do we, we've got millions of posts, we've got 600 or so people who have been arrested, and we've got all these events that led up to January 6th that we know were influential. So what's our starting point? Our starting point really has to be about the people who really figure very prominently in the story of January 6th. And those people are the people who were arrested. So we're calling them the contesters, because they went to the Capitol to contest the elections and the results. And then we have the objectors, and those are the Congress folks who raised formal objections to the certification of results on January 6th. And then we have the influencers. And these are the folks who are very close to the Trump campaign, who promulgated either through litigation or through their own events or activities, the big lie, this idea that the elections somehow were fraudulent, or the voting machines had somehow been overtaken by China or whatever. And so looking at those 3 categories of individuals, we need to also see, well, to what degree did they interact with Parler or other alt tech media like Rumble, Gab, Telegram, and so forth. So a lot of what we're doing now is cross-platform analysis to try and understand what is the relationship between these 3 groups of people in a networked sense, both online and offline, and what can we learn about the way elite signaling from politicians, influential people, creates a feedback loop between ordinary folks who are online using this technology and may be more vulnerable for whatever reasons, or more amenable to some of the messaging that they see online. So that's the basic outline of the project. I think some of our big takeaways from a preliminary perspective is that there clearly is a relationship between, sort of racialized discussions and debates that have been going on over the last, couple of years, in the lead up to the 2020 election, and that there's a lot of cohesion amongst, particular groups, militias in particular, street movements like the Proud Boys, and that cohesion is actually very visible online and offline, and in some ways may give us a sense that sort of predictive analysis if we do this work further. We're not there yet by any stretch, but we are beginning to kind of probe into that area, and I think this is a pretty exciting time to be doing this research, because we know also that the 2022 elections and 2024 elections may have some of the same challenges in terms of public safety and divisive politics that could cause people to act violently, as a result of the outcome or on the way to the elections themselves. So with that, I'm going to stop there because I'm sure there are lots of questions. and let Jeff kind of jump in as well.
Great, thanks, Candace. And you said it wasn't sunny there, but I can see the stream. The sun is now streaming in across your face. That's a good positive sign. I'm going to start with the first question that I had and was raised by your conversation. And maybe it's a little bit off topic. Some of the other questions coming in are more specific to the actual work you're doing. But I kind of want you to think. So, public safety, social norms were enforced by government regulation through the FCC for generations in the media world. Clearly, the FCC is not getting involved in something like this at the same level. So where does governance happen in the information space today? And are Amazon and Apple and Microsoft and Google now responsible for that?
That is such a great question. So it's interesting. I think governance is becoming much like customary law, right? When we think about international law, we have like sort of, the law that's on the books. So we've got the Geneva Conventions, we've got all kinds of treaties. And then we think about sort of, how decisions are made by different judicial venues, right? And in a lot of ways, that's kind of where we are with governance of internet technologies and network communication technologies, where you've got different venues and some of the big stakeholders happen to dominate in those venues. Okay, so a good example, obviously, are the big five, right? Amazon, Apple, Google, and so forth. They have a huge influence on not only the governance of platforms, but they're vertically integrated, right? And so they also have influence on the architecture, the literal physical architecture, and then the logic of how that architecture is managed, right, to create information flows. So they're unique. They're like big whales out there in the ocean of customary law, because they're so outsized in their influence from top to bottom throughout the entire networked communication system. But then you also have these other governance mechanisms, like the International Telecommunications Union, right, which is the kind of the standard setter for how network technologies and communications generally. It used to be sort of telegraph and telephone lines and that sort of thing, but today, of course, it also encompasses the internet as well. And that body, of course, is in this kind of tug of war between some of the big state players: Russia, China, the United States, and a few others. India, Brazil, those are also very significant because they do have a certain kind of prowess. And obviously, the European Union is another factor here, right? They're setting standards. And so there's kind of like multiple layers, I would say. And so when we're thinking about governance, we often talk about it in the context of content moderation, but that's kind of small ball. Really, like content moderation is like the last resort, or like the not even the tip of the spear. I'd say it's like the way back end of the spear, because it's really about sort of rules of the road for the design of the architecture of technologies that are part of a governance mechanism, as well as also rules of the road for algorithms and how they're deployed and what they can collect and the ways in which they can be used to service a platform. So lots of different moving parts in the ecosystem.
Yeah. Do you see that? I mean, I assume that's going to evolve over the course of time, especially when you start seeing the hazard to public safety that's presented by some of these media outlets. So that's excellent. It's food for thought too. That's a different way to think through it. Okay, so I'll get to some of the questions from the participants. I kind of go in the order in which I received them. So if I don't get to yours, I apologize. But first question was pretty straightforward. Is there a reason why online message boards such as 4chan and 8chan are not on your target list?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One reason is we just simply didn't collect them. And we also are aware that other people have collected them and are doing that work. And I think one of the issues, of course, always with this work is like, well, what's out there publicly available? And what can we actually, do we have the skills and the tools that we need to grab it and then make sense of it? But I do agree that I think that's quite right, that 4chan, 8chan, 8kun are in their own way, right? The image boards are extremely important, part of the conversation. The difference with them is simply in a way they've been overcovered. And I think they kind of are an exception to the rule. They haven't been booted off, with the exception, of course, 8chan, right? So 8chan is one of these weird scenarios where it's been deplatformed a couple different times, right? And which is why it's now 8kun. But we are much more interested in how both tech stakeholders and the government and the public responded to January 6th and specifically. And because Parler was so central to that conversation, that narrative, we thought it was important to focus first on Parler and then some of the others.
Okay. Another question from a participant. Is it your sense that Parler might have been perceived by certain groups as more trustworthy or maybe even private and gave them a sense of freedom to express extreme views, or is that not, are you finding that, I guess?
That is a super interesting question. I think what we're finding, one of our current running theories is that Parler had if you read, by the way, I should mention that, Parler has sued Amazon in court. Initially it was in federal court, but now it's back in King County Court in Washington State, where Amazon, of course, is headquartered. And that case is still going forward. And so, a lot of what I'm telling you here is coming from the argumentation in that brief that was filed back in January and then evolved since March. So Parler argues that its business model is no different than Facebook's, right? That it was good at content management, and it did do a good job of warning the FBI, which of course they did write letters saying we were worried, we're worried about what we're seeing in our content online. But I think one of our current theories of the case is that because Parler took a really interesting route in terms of its business model, in terms of not directly selling their user data to advertisers, that then raises the question, well, how were they making money, right? Like, what was the revenue structure for this company? And the only thing that we kind of can surmise, or at least the thing that sort of raises our curiosity, is the fact that Parler was so easy to hack and had such low security barriers. And I should say that all that information was publicly available, so it's not quite hacking, right? It's not like a breach in the illegal sense, but it's more sort of what's publicly available out there. So were there design features that were intentional, where the so-called key to of Parler's users was actually never inserted into the door lock, basically. That is to say, the whole model is that, of course, Parler doesn't have to sell its information directly to advertisers because it's already freely available, right? So it is possible that an average consumer, I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't done this research. And an average consumer is thinking, well, it probably has the same protections as Twitter and Facebook, right? When I sign up, it's got all these kind of default protections. Well, it turns out it didn't really at all.
Is that going to impact, you think, the lawsuit? Is that part and parcel to the legal battle that's going on then between Parler and Amazon?
Well,
security.
I have not seen Amazon make those arguments. It's a bit early. The actual trial is, I think, scheduled for like late February of next year. And it is only just now the case has been shifted from federal court into state court. And so we've only just begun the discovery phase right now. So it's hard to say, but one thing I think Amazon seems to be pushing back on is this idea that it's a monopoly, and therefore that is why it acted to crush Parler, right? Right. Basically, it was trying to crush a startup that was going to somehow challenge, this, right, it was a $1.5 trillion company.
Yeah, got it. All right, another question from a participant says, can you elaborate a bit further on how and if Parler evolved out of right-wing sites like the Daily Stormer, which were also removed by server providers after the Unite the Right rally?
Well, okay, that's an interesting question. I'm going to, I'm speaking slightly out of turn here, and and I know that my colleagues would urge me to be really cautious about making any leaps and conclusions about causation and so how things connect. But we are aware, for instance, that there is a data set out there of Facebook users who would have been considered persuadable circa 2015. So you may remember in the Cambridge Analytica saga, that, you had this UK-based entity that was backed by Robert Mercer and his daughter, Rebecca Mercer. They invested all this money and energy into seeing, how could you target particularly vulnerable or persuadable voters with certain types of messages, and could you push them, influence them in their behavior and their choices through micro-targeting, right? So it does seem like that there is a possibility that some of those same individuals in the so-called Persuadables Cambridge Analytica data set migrated progressively to Parler. That's just one example. There probably are other examples out there. Are there members, followers of the Daily Stormer who followed Parler? Probably. Are there, folks who were on 4chan and 8chan and 8kun, who are Parler users? Probably. But interestingly, I think there's a much more visible migration that happens when Parler is turned off, from Parler to Gab and Rumble, right, which are even less moderated than Parler, right, and are much more proximate in the sort of constellation of the sort of fringe far-right ecosystem to 4chan and 8chan and 8kun, even than Parler is, right? So I do think there's probably some evidence there, but that is the work that we'd like to be able to do, is that kind of cross-platform analysis.
Sure. Great. I think you caveated your answer enough too to keep your colleagues happy. That was good. All right. So this question I thought was pretty interesting, especially in light of the fact that you were in fact on Capitol Hill the day of January 6th. That are analysts like yourself involved in the efforts by law enforcement to preempt these type of events? Because there's been some since, at least rumored. Do you have insight onto the types of methods these law enforcement officers use to preempt or react to these events?
The answer is no, we don't do that. We are very, very keen to stay neutral. Of course, we are happy to talk to members of the government, law enforcement, about what we're doing, give them a sense of our insight as much as we would members of the public, right? Or even this community, right? So we're very careful though about maintaining our neutrality and our objectivity. And we want to be careful about, when we talk about public intelligence, we're really talking about public interest intelligence, okay? And so we're not here to serve the purposes of a government that may or may not have a good idea of how to govern at any given time. And I mean that not just in the US context, but in other contexts in conflict areas, you have to be really careful about how you interact. As to the work that law enforcement is doing, my perception is that it's not very advanced, and that they're probably, in the same place that most researchers are when it comes to thinking about all the different transects of information that you would need, the kind of data that you would need to have some sort of predictive capability and then intervene. I don't see that evolving yet, although I know those conversations are going on. It's certainly not there in the federal level, and who knows what the local level looks like.
Right. Good. A little more practical question. Have you and the team had to develop a social media analysis tool similar to NodeXL to conduct your content analysis? Basically, what's the technique?
Oh, I wish Tom was here.
He's a useful fellow.
So there have been a lot of tool creation, and I wish I could say like what I knew how to describe every single tool. But I will say we did create, Sean and Tom worked together to create an Elasticsearch tool, which allows us to take very large data sets with all kinds of data in it, not just social media data, and make it a little bit more searchable for people like me who are just a journalist with some interest in kind of quantitative stuff. So we can kind of go in and sort of see trends. It has a nice visualization interface, so we can kind of very immediately kind of make some suppositions about what it is we're seeing in these very, very large data sets. That's just one tool, this Elasticsearch tool that's been created to exploit the data. Tom has, in all of the work that we've done, Tom has done a lot of work around creating tools that allow us to make sense of sort of networked behavior online, which is actually his specialty, of course. is looking at sort of the geographics, I should say the geometry of networked communities and relationships. And a lot of those tools have been extremely helpful. I should mention that we're also working with Princeton University's Bridging Divides initiative, and they've created this location-based events database that has huge numbers of information, events about protests and demonstrations that are subcoded, that include things like, when there was a Proud Boys march, a Black Lives Matter march. And so that helps us, that other data set helps us kind of get a sense of like what was happening comparatively. And we're trying to find ways to work with a geographer who is on that team to see if we can do some statistical analysis that hardens a little bit some of our observations and make sure that we're kind of coloring within the lines methodologically.
Great. Another question, do you think some of the various protest groups' outsized influence on social media is in any way related to the narrative control on those same platform by our intelligence agency, State Department, corporate media, et cetera, or the sort of establishment's increasingly narrow Overton window?
The Overton window. I think that the internet is an extremely complex networked system of communications and information flows and exchange. I think that legacy media players, because they were first to market in terms of moving away from command-based interfaces to the World Wide Web, have had a huge influence on what gets seen and what gets, I think, focused on and pushed up. But I don't think they're any more powerful. And in fact, I think they're becoming increasingly less powerful in influencing different frames of reference. And I think the larger challenges are actually from these big tech companies and the lack of ability to govern or the lack of political will to govern those technologies and those technology companies.
I think that's a really important point, and I think that's right. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. The voices, obviously, the legitimacy or trustworthiness of the voices on these media outlets is critical, and quite frankly, there's no indication in any of my experience that those other that basically our U.S. government agencies are particularly good at any of that stuff. We've tried it for generations now in other countries, and we failed at it. So it's not.
Yeah, let me also just I want to put a point on the fact. I mean, without insulting, all of my wonderfully passionate and I think very committed colleagues here in Washington who work in government, I think they would be the first to tell you that there just aren't the resources or the capacity available to any of the government agencies right now to control anything.
Yeah.
In fact,
I've encouraged my students to throw the word control out of their vocabulary when it comes to things, and especially in the information domain. I mean, there's some voices that will dominate, but not control anything. So
that's right.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I don't mean to be bad mouthing anybody. I know the efforts are there. I know there's quite a lot of wisdom and insights in these agencies that it's just very difficult to execute based upon all sorts of constraints. Some of them monetary, fiscal constraints. Others are actually legal or ethical constraints too. So
that's right, exactly.
So that's an important point. So another question real quick. Do you have thoughts regarding how the line might be drawn between freedom of speech and the ease with which mis and disinformation can be spread with these social media platforms, and who enforces that line? That's the $64 million question.
I actually think that question's a red herring. I think what we're learning from the whistleblowers' documentation on Facebook is that content moderation is clearly a very subjective exercise. And, I mean, it's people who are making decisions about what is bad and what is good, and developing kind of systems for doing that and communicating that to each other internally and then externally. And it's people who, let's just, if we're going to use Facebook as the example, because I think it's a prime one, right? You have people, somewhere in California making lots of decisions about people and how they communicate somewhere in Myanmar or Bangladesh or Afghanistan or Nigeria. And those people in California don't speak, Bengali, right? They don't speak Burmese. And so they're kind of, they're subcontracting out their own content moderation responsibilities to people that they have no ability to check, whether or not what the models that are being applied and standards that are being applied in California can be applied, not just can they be applied in the context of Myanmar or Bangladesh? Maybe not, right? There could be a lot of reasons why you can't do that. We really have to pay attention to the platform architecture. It's really key. It is not about the content. Yes, the content is problematic, right? But toxicity gets rewarded in our current business model, right? Mm-hmm. We know this from Facebook, right? Mm-hmm. And from all the leaks. And that it happens to be true on every single one of these platforms, that engagement, outrage engagement, and performative behavior is what is rewarded on these platforms. And so, Malcolm McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan, of course, talked about this very famously. The medium is the message. Mm-hmm. And the medium here is a very performative medium. You don't go online to talk about, what you had for breakfast or share, your kitten photos because you're a very private person. Okay. You go online because you want to share that information in a way that shows you're part of a community, which is a performance, mm-hmm. right? And violence is also very performative when it's political. And so weirdly, there's a lot more work that I think these big tech companies and providers, and frankly, the Federal Communications Commission need to do to think about, okay, well, how do we attenuate the use of these algorithms and this reward system so that we're not rewarding violence, that we're not rewarding hate speech. I'm less concerned about what's said and much more concerned about the architecture of how it is pushed around.
Yeah, you're getting pushback from someone in the audience on that, but I think perhaps I'll ask the question: isn't the fact that toxicity and negativity is rewarded on these platforms an indication that what we have here is a human problem and not a technological one? But technology is not the only part of the platform you're talking about, right? I mean, technology is the structure of the platform itself is not just purely technological, right? It's how you get likes and how you do those sorts of things that actually provide the rewards, not necessarily just the technology. So it's not a technological issue you're discussing.
That's right. I mean, so you could imagine a situation, I'll give you an example, where the FCC could say, if you, platform provider X, have a user base that you have verified has 60% children, okay, 60% of the people, your user base is under 18. You cannot use an algorithm that rewards violent or outrage or dark, okay, or negative engagement, okay? That literally could be a regulation. Just like back in the old days, okay, during Saturday cartoons, you cannot run, okay, whiskey commercials, right? It's pretty straightforward. Like, so yes, it's a human problem, but we're a little bit confused about our own values and how we've applied them in the past in these other kind of policy contexts around communications.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really, really excellent point. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our questions here. I know there's some folks who are, first of all, really good engagement by the audience, because I asked a bunch of questions from the audience. They are not all from the same person. There were a couple from the same person, but a lot of really thoughtful engagement. I kind of want to make a point too, just a little pitch for this series that we've been created here through the MA in Global Security with our professors like Candace. The ASU Center on the Future of War's Weaponized Narrative Initiative was one of the very first important voices in the discourse about the weaponization of the modern information sphere. And in January, I'm on a host on the 5th anniversary of its launch. The initiative was launched with a white paper on weaponized narrative. We'll be hosting one of the initiative's co-founders, Professor Brad Allenby, in an event to discuss the current state and role of information domain plays in global security, domestic order, and indeed the Western liberal democratic model in general, which you didn't discuss much, Candace. And I know there's some concern about social order and in the information domain and how how January 6th actually portends some trouble in that area. Do you have thoughts on that? Did you want to share?
I do. Thank you for asking that. I think it's a really important point. I don't want to over-focus on the technology and kind of like what the data tells us in this kind of, myopic way. We should be really concerned about what we saw on January 6th and what the data is telling us about what we saw. Because I really do think, one of the impacts, of course, of deplatforming Parler and also kind of this unresolved tension around how to govern social media platforms leaves us in a very vulnerable position in the United States, but also obviously in other countries in the world that are also trying to govern their populations, right? There's a pretty good chance that we're going to see these types of influence campaigns morph. And in fact, I would say one observation that's really key. In 2016, just after 2016, we were talking about Russian interference and, the kind of tools, techniques, and tactics that was used by the Internet Research Agency and the SVR and the GRU, the two intelligence agencies of Russia. And, a lot of us got a good schooling in all of that, right? And how, Russia did what it did. There has been some learning in some of these far right communities from that experience. And it was directly applied in the case of the 2020 elections. And there's plenty of evidence to show that there was, a borrowing of tools, tactics, and techniques. And that's what's frightening about that, of course, is that when, American citizens begin to turn these tools on their own people, and then external actors like China and Russia, have decided they have a dog in the fight. Then the amplification prospects become much more frightening. And I think we're going to find ourselves in a very, very difficult and delicate situation in 2024.
If not sooner. There were apparently last night in the Virginia elections, several of the attendees at the January 6th demonstration actually were elected to the Virginia House. So I mean, there's mainstream affinity for the ideas and viewpoints held by people who are fairly extreme, I suspect. But
yeah,
that's
it's
just true in Arizona as anywhere else, quite frankly. In a lot.
Well, we have members of Congress, right? Who are adherents of the QAnon, movement, and I think we're going to see that number grow, at the local and federal level. That would
be the metric for what you're saying about the amplification process and the effects of it. I think that'd be one of the metrics. Okay, I think I promised Candace we keep it under an hour. The questions seem to have died out. Candace, thank you so much. We deeply appreciate you spending time with us. This is a great research project. I know it's still fairly new. Make sure you hit the New America website, take a look at their work with the Wagner Group. It's also cutting edge, first rate stuff. The techniques and stuff they're developing are being copied by others now at this point to do follow-on research. So we're very proud to have you on our team, Candace, and we're thankful you spent time with us today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming, and keep an eye on your emails for upcoming events the rest of the fall and into the spring. Thank you so much.